So I've already spoken a bit about the Salem Covenant. The folks in Salem, Massachusetts, our religious ancestors, who shortly after having survived a perilous journey in a small boat across a large ocean, having watched some of their compatriots die, very grateful to be alive themselves, yet rather daunted by the challenges facing them, founded the church they'd been dreaming of since they left Europe. Knowing they would need each other to survive, eager to claim at last their task of creating a better world, they made the most powerful, most binding promise they could come up with. We covenant together. We covenant to journey together in truth and affection as best we know them now or may learn them in days to come, that we and our children may be fulfilled and that we may speak to the world in words and actions of peace and goodwill. Many congregations who observe congregational polity, who have no church hierarchy above them, who sometimes call themselves the free church, have adopted their own covenants ever since. Covenant is a big word that basically means a promise with oomph. It's a promise with a vertical component. So a promise made between two people or sort of a horizontal conversation. A covenant explicitly references a vertical component, a higher shared value, whether the two people making the promise have a shared value that's called God or love or truth or human spirit. It's an explicit recognition that we mean this in a deeper, stronger way. Covenant means promise. So 265 years after the Salem Covenant, the very end of the 19th century, 1894, in the Unitarian Church of Evanston, Illinois, the Reverend Mr. James Villa Blake wrote this covenant, which might sound a little familiar, also a little odd. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. When our UUA published Hymns of the Spirit in 1937, they included an affirmation which the Reverend Mr. L. Griswold Williams had published in his book, Antiphonal Readings for Free Worship, a few years earlier. Williams had collected and combined the words used by several different congregations. His 1937 version went, "Love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve mankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God." Interestingly, the entire red-covered Hymns of the Spirit only contains the word covenant once. In the service for confirmation or reception of new members, it says, quote, "The minister and people shall then repeat together the covenant of their church," or the following: "In the love of truth and the Spirit of Jesus, we unite for the worship of God and the service of man." The words by James Villa Blake and L. Griswold Williams are in Hymns of the Spirit, but they're called affirmations in that hymnal. The same goes for the 1964 blue-covered Hymns for the Celebration of Life. It contains both the Blake and Williams formulations, still named affirmations. By the time our UUA published Singing the Living Tradition, these gray hymnals around the room in 1993, they listed all these words as covenants. Singing the Living Tradition also removed the most egregious of the sexist language, changing to serve mankind in fellowship to serve human need. Many of our sibling congregations recite covenants which are some variation or some combination of these words, and you can see on the wall that we do have a variation ourselves. All of these covenants are intended to inspire the people who speak them. Our circumstances have changed over the years and the centuries, and while the specific concerns change and come and go, our lives are still complex combinations of peril and promise, joy and sorrow, horror and awe-inspiring moments of sacrifice and love. Through all of that, we still gather together, knowing that we still need each other to thrive. We still promise, using the strongest language we can think of, to journey together, supporting and challenging each other to be more ethical, more compassionate, more courageous as we serve the world with words and actions of peace and goodwill. We ask our partners on these journeys to keep their promises and to hold us accountable for the promises that we make. As our spiritual ancestors, century upon century, we too are promise-making, promise-breaking, and promise-keeping peoples. So may we be.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Very good to be here. I'm usually on Zoom. I'm usually here, but I'm usually on Zoom. Okay. You're going to hear this a lot today. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is our covenant. I speak to you as a person who was not raised in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. I found my way to a UU church in Dayton, Ohio, when I was in my late 30s. I had just moved to Dayton and was looking not for dogma, but for community, and I found it. I don't remember hearing the words of the covenant that we say at this church every week, although I might have. I do remember that I became part of that church community fairly quickly, which was surprising because I am quite introverted. It can feel hard for me to integrate into a new set of humans, but I met people there who were kind and welcoming, and I assimilated quickly. Unfortunately, I became very ill during the few years I attended that UU church. Almost as quickly as I felt a part of the church community, I became so sick that I rarely attended services and even more rarely participated in other activities. But during that time, people from the church came to visit me in my apartment where I lived alone. They brought me food and books to read, and a stuffed animal that I have since lost track of, a little white bear that held in its paws a red cardboard box with white hearts on it. The way I remember it, the woman who gave it to me said that the box held gifts for me. Now, I was quite ill and in a massive brain fog at the time, and I remember feeling very confused when I looked in the box after she left and it was empty. I was too sick to worry about it, though, and didn't question her somewhat magical description of the red box. I just held on to that little bear often and cried into its fur, and felt humbled by the caring that these people who were practically strangers showed to me for months. I look back now and I know those were the gifts this bear brought to me. By the time I was recovering enough to attend church more often, The congregation had purchased a building almost an hour away from where I lived. I was not well enough to make the drive, and I lost that UU connection. Around that time, though, I ended up meeting the man I would marry, and he and his family became enough connection and community for me until I was gradually well enough to expand my world a little more. I didn't ever return to the UU church, though. Many years later, in 2020, when COVID hit and we were in lockdown, I was, like so many others, completely isolated, this time in a different apartment in Ohio, where I lived alone in the aftermath of a divorce I did not see coming. Zoom was a blessing, and I went looking online for a UU church in South Bend, Indiana. My son had moved to South Bend by then. He had been hired by IU South Bend to work in the archives in their library. It was my secret hope that I might be able to move near my son, so checking out a UU church in the area felt like a smart step to take. Now, if I hadn't liked what I heard on Zoom, if I hadn't been able to feel like I could form connections with some of the folks from the First Unitarian Church of South Bend, I would have moved on. But I connected with Chip's sermons immediately. I loved how eclectic he was. You never knew where he was going to take you. And the small groups that stayed online for a while after the services ended became a lifeline for me. In fact, I recently came across a spiral notebook in which every Sunday that I attended on Zoom, I wrote the date and the names of the people who were in my chat room. I know most of those people now. It's a whole other story how I came to be working for First Unitarian as the office manager, but I do want to say it's a bit of a strange position to be in. I am an employee of this church, and this is the only church in the area that I want to attend. So you are my employer and my spiritual home right now. Chip is certainly the only minister in the area that I wish to have as a spiritual mentor, and he and I have had many conversations, off the clock, of course, about various topics, including how much the covenant that we say every week means to me. This is a little embarrassing to admit, but it actually makes me want to cry sometimes. I think it touches a tender part of my heart, maybe a damaged part of my heart. It feels like a description of how I wish I had been treated growing up, and it feels really good to think of being treated that way now. I am truly grateful that Chip has given me this opportunity to share with you a little bit of why I react to the covenant the way I do. It's still new to me, but I suspect that for some of you, the power of the message might have faded a bit over time. That's human. Sometimes when we say words repeatedly, they do lose a little bit of their glow. If that has happened to any of you, maybe my sharing will remind you just how powerful this message is. Maybe it will encourage you to renew the vow, so to speak, that we make to each other every week. The strongest reaction I've had to this covenant is that it feels like a promise of kindness. We promise to help one another. The word love is used twice. We promise to dwell together in peace. It's so beautiful, and it speaks to an ideal framework for how to conduct ourselves when we enter this building or log on to Zoom. Because we are human, though, we are quite likely not to live up to the ideals of this covenant at times, maybe even often. That's okay. It is okay to be human, and it is okay, and I think important, to transcend that humanness when we can. One of the ways we might do that is to check in with ourselves every so often, individually and collectively, and ask ourselves, how are we doing living up to the ideals of this covenant? If we could do better, that means things will need to change a little. For things to get better, they have to change, right? But we'll never change anything if we don't, number one, become aware of what we might want to change, And number two, decide that we do want to change it, because let's face it, change is hard for humans. It's possible, but it takes effort, which is a talk for another day. My belief is that if we do want to do a better job of showing kindness to each other, it's important to start with being kind to yourself. If we have fallen short of these ideals, it will not be helpful to beat ourselves up about it. If our assessment is that someone else has fallen short, it won't be helpful to beat them up either. Instead, it will be a kindness to give ourselves and others a bit of grace. I think it's hard sometimes being introspective, admitting we were wrong, apologizing, because it can feel embarrassing. For me, in the past, doing a self-assessment about anything made me feel worse about myself than I already did. I'm happy to say I got over that. Took a bit of work, but I did it. I think today I am pretty brave about looking at my part in situations that didn't go well without shame or self-recrimination. I do want to always become a better version of myself, and that means putting in the time and effort to do so. What I have found is that in the process of doing an assessment of my part in situations that could have gone better, it helps to apply the tenets of the covenant. Maybe this will help you too. Seek your truth in love. Focus on how you can dwell together with others with peace in your heart. You deserve that. Let us help one another instead of making life harder on each other. There's enough of that going on out there in the larger world. Maybe if we each occasionally renew our commitment to the covenant, this church can be a sanctuary for all of us. And yes, we need to solve the problems that inevitably arise in human interactions, but let us seek the collective truth in love. Let's listen to one another and focus on the many ways we can get things right and forgive ourselves and each other when we don't. In 12-step groups that I've attended over the years, we often call the 12 steps our lighthouse beam. When things seem to be falling apart, we slow down, we sit, and we read the words of the steps. It's very soothing and grounding. That's how I feel when I recite our covenant. When I'm feeling overwhelmed and about to behave in a way that I'll have to make amends for later, if I will just remember to do this, I repeat the words to myself. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is our covenant.